Don Campbell. He's a co-chair of PECC, also chair of the Canadian Committee for APEC. We will first start with the presentation by Mr. Pedrosa, following which we will have the Q&A session. Can we kindly ask you to identify yourself as you ask the question? Keep the questions brief and relevant. As you came in, I'm sure some of you may have been given the documents related to the briefing, some of the copies of the PowerPoint slides, and then the press release. If you need any more info, please go to pecc.org. The report will be available online as well, and please don't hesitate to contact us.
Well, thank you, Jessica. As co-chairman of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning, along with my co-chair, Ambassador Tang, who has been recently elected the co-chairman of PECC, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. For those of you who are not familiar with the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, it is an independent, non-profit, policy-oriented organization dedicated to the promotion of a stable and prosperous Asia-Pacific. For those of you familiar with the lingo, it's a Track 2 organization, but very closely associated with the APEC economies, and we have official observer status with APEC. The report that we're going to be presenting to you is done annually. This is the 10th annual report on the state of the Union of the Asia-Pacific region. And without further ado, I will hand you over to our Secretary General Eduardo Pedrosa to present the report.
Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I think could we have the presentation up on the screen? Thank you very much. As has almost become a tradition, I always get questions on what is this cover of your report? What does this mean? Well, the tree, of course, I think represents the growth of the region. It, of course, has been growing. And what we wanted to really emphasize here with having the tree concept was the idea of inclusive growth. The foundations underpinning the tree are, of course, the foundations of growth. But the message that we wanted to convey to you today is that there are some blocks missing. The foundation isn't perhaps as stable as it needs to be. And there are many things that the region needs to do to promote further inclusive growth in the region. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. One more, please. Thank you. Well, Ambassador Campbell has already presented to you who and what we are. The report I'm introducing today is the State of the Region report. This is an overview of the major developments in the Asia-Pacific region. Chapter 1 covers structural reforms as drivers of growth and inclusion. Chapter 2, it's the results of the survey that we do every year, of views of stakeholders on key issues. This year, our focus was on promoting inclusive growth and structural reform. And the third chapter is an annual index that we do on measuring economic integration in the region. Next slide, please. What I'll be focusing on today are the results of the survey that we do every year. This year, we had the responses from 710 opinion leaders from the Asia-Pacific community. We did this from the 21st of September to the 16th of October this year. What I'm showing to you in this slide is the mix. It's a multi-stakeholder survey. Most of the respondents come from what we describe as the non-government sector, which is composed of academics, those from civil society, and many of you from the media. I hope some of you from the media actually responded to this survey. Those from government and those from business. I think in some lingo, what we're trying to do is to get views from APEC Street, those people are really working on Asia-Pacific issues. Next slide, please. This is the breakdown of respondents by sub-region. As you can see, a large proportion come from Southeast Asia, where, of course, we are here today. That's about 34%. And then Northeast Asia and the rest of the region. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. What I'm showing to you here is, if you like, the big picture. What is happening in the regional economy? The average growth for the region has really slowed down from an average rate of around 5% growth to around 3.5%. This year, we're really seeing the lowest growth rate for the Asia-Pacific region since the bounce of 2010 from the global financial crisis. And what we think is there is therefore an urgent need to rethink growth strategies. Today, economies really aspire to and demand growth that is both sustainable and inclusive. So the question that we wanted to answer was where will future growth come from? What I would ask you to bear in mind is that much of the growth in the post-crisis period has been sustained by really what would be described as massive stimulus, either fiscal or monetary. These stimuli cannot continue indefinitely. We're already talking about the raising of, say, US interest rates. So in this phase of the post-recovery, really some consideration needs to be given to where the future growth will come from. Next slide, please. There are some initiatives that are already underway that could provide a substantial boost to growth. One of them is the recently concluded TPP negotiations. By some estimates, you're talking around $250 billion to global GDP by 2025. The RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, around $650 billion to additional GDP. And the proposed free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which would provide an estimated almost $2.2 trillion to global GDP. There are other propositions that are underway. APEC has a connectivity blueprint. The ASEAN Economic Community is due to be concluded and implemented by the end of this year, and the Asian Infrastructure Bank promises to provide a new source of funding for infrastructure development. Next slide, please. So we asked our panelists for their views on what did they think were their views on the outlook for the global economy. Drawing your attention to the far right of this slide, what you see is around 40% of respondents to our survey expected growth to be slower next year. And I think this really reflects a somewhat a sentiment that's growing on the negative. As I said, global growth this year, or regional growth, will be the lowest since the global financial crisis. We also ask respondents for their views on specific economies. Largely, they were quite optimistic about the United States, Southeast Asia, and the Indian economies. There was some pessimism about China and Russia. Views were split on Japan. If you look at sentiments by sub-region, North Americans and Southeast Asians were actually the most pessimistic about growth for the next 12 months. So what are the risks to growth that they face? So could I have the next slide, please? The top risk to growth is a slowdown in the Chinese economy. As most of you know, China's economy had been growing at around 10%, decelerating down to 8%. So this is something we almost take somewhat for granted, that this is something that's planned. There's a planned deceleration and trying to manage that quite carefully. Some of the risks in this list are those that are in the media almost every day. They don't surprise us. These are issues like unfavorable currency alignments, a possible sharp fall in asset prices. What I wanted to focus on today was the second highest risk to growth in this list, which is the failure to implement structural reforms. Close to 60% of respondents to our survey picked this as a possible risk to growth for their economy over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. This slide breaks that survey finding down by sub-region. What you see here are two sort of major things that I wanted to highlight. Number one is that this is a risk that is shared across the entire Asia-Pacific region. Everyone from North America, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and South America rated this as a potentially high risk to growth for their economies. The second thing I would highlight to you is compared to the survey that we did last year, the number of people selecting this as a risk to growth has substantially increased. I wanted to put this finding into some context. When the global financial crisis struck, there was a widespread acknowledgement that reforms had to be made to get growth growing. But to avoid a disaster of the magnitude of the Great Depression, some of these extraordinary measures that I mentioned in terms of fiscal and monetary stimulus were done. This has helped to support growth since the crisis, but it cannot go on indefinitely, and neither can these reforms. We use the term structural reform in the policy world quite a lot, but I thought it would be helpful a little bit to put some context and give you something concrete to explain what we mean. So could I have the next slide, please? What I'm showing to you is the number of mobile subscribers in the Philippines, where we are today, and the number of mobile subscribers per 100 in OECD countries. On your left, you have a nice picture of what a cell phone looked like back in 1990. Of course, no one really had cell phones back then, whether you were in the Philippines, any emerging economy, or an advanced economy. But what you see in the blue line is mobile penetration went very, very quickly in the OECD countries and started off somewhat slowly in the Philippines, but in the last 15 or so years, that penetration has accelerated considerably. Part of the reason for that acceleration are some of the reforms that took place in the Philippine telecoms sector regulation during the mid to late 90s. So this is just to give you a sense of what these reforms can do and why they are potentially important. We define structural reforms as changes in government institutions, regulations and policies designed to create a business environment that supports efficient markets, with the goal of structural reform to bolster the strength and efficiency of markets to enhance living standards. So I don't think anyone would really dispute that those reforms in the telecom sector were really a substantial boon to everyone. I remember when I still lived in Manila back in the mid to late 90s, it was incredibly hard to get a mobile, to get even a telephone line. Now it's much easier. You can just go to the nearest mall and buy a SIM card. Those reforms are really essential and have changed everyone's lives, I think, for the better. Next slide, please. Structural reforms, as I said, they are ubiquitous. They cut across the entire economy. We wanted to get a sense of what the Asia-Pacific policy community thought was important. So we asked our respondents to let us know what they thought were important to the future growth of their economies. There are some ones here in this slide. What you see is 83% of respondents to our survey thought that innovation and entrepreneurship were very important to future growth. Reforms in the education and labor market, infrastructure, regulation, and financial sector policies. There were, I would sort of highlight to you, it's in the report, and I would draw your attention to it, some differences among respondents on what elements of reform were important to them. There was convergence on issues such as innovation, education, and labor, and there were divergences on the rule of law, competition, property use, business management, education, and social support. These findings tend to reflect the state of play in each respective economy's policy environment and really tally very well with some of the sort of analysis that others have done on the policy environment in those countries. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight education and labor. Analysis shows that some of the gains to productivity, the biggest gains, come from reforms in education and labor markets. But we wanted to get a sense of what people thought were priorities, where were their issues. The way we framed this question was to ask for the level of satisfaction that people had with each of the following in their economies. And what you see here is that respondents were least satisfied. They were least happy with the match between educational training and the actual needs in the economy, cooperation between education providers and employers, wage and working hour flexibility, the ability to secure skilled staff, and skills and labor mobility. And there was a fairly high level of convergence on these issues. I would highlight that those from emerging economies tended to have much lower levels of satisfaction compared to those from advanced economies. And at the very least, the conclusion that I draw from these survey findings is that there is a perception of a mismatch between education systems and the labor market. So addressing those will be critical for the next phase to growth. Next slide, please. Infrastructure is something that everyone, at least especially in the Philippines and around the emerging Asia-Pacific, cares about very deeply. We wanted to get a sense of priorities in this sector. And what we found with the survey findings were that land transportation systems, there was the least level of satisfaction with land transportation systems, followed by sea transportation, and then broadband internet access. I've been reading the newspapers here, and I see some dissatisfaction here. I saw that for APEC, there's been extra bandwidth given, and the question being asked, I think, in some of the media here is, why can't we have that every day? Why can't every day be APEC Day? Specifically to Southeast Asia, 46% of respondents to our survey expressed dissatisfaction with broadband internet access. Next slide, please. So we asked this set of questions a slightly different way. The theme for this year's APEC meetings has been inclusive growth. So we asked the policy community what they thought the priorities should be. And these very much sort of tally with the findings on priorities for structural reform. It's the provision of education. Generally, it was very, very important. 75 or so percent thought that was important, very important. The second most important was reducing corruption. And the third most important was providing support to micro and small and medium enterprises. Those of you who have been covering APEC throughout the year, especially during the Boracay cluster of meetings, will know that the Philippines has placed this as one of the highest priorities this year, and they've come up with an action agenda on finding ways to help small and medium enterprises benefit from trade. Next slide, please. The sort of final big question that we have that we always ask every year is, what does the policy community think should be the priorities for APEC leaders when they meet in Manila? And these really echo the themes that the Philippines has set for APEC, and as well as the ongoing priorities and core work program for APEC. So the first was progress towards the BOGO goals and the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. The second was the APEC growth strategy that was adopted in response to the global financial crisis. The third, SME participation, as I've already mentioned to you with respect to other questions, corruption, climate change, and disaster resilience. Very important, I think, for the Philippines and other economies in this region, which are part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, and so on. You might be a little bit confused by this chart, so let me explain. What I'm showing to you is the percentage of respondents who selected these as top 5 priorities for the region. The ordering of priorities is somewhat different because these are weighted by the relative importance that our respondents gave to the specific issue. Next slide, please. As a summary, what I would argue, and that these are the key highlights from the report, is that this is a very challenging environment for growth this year. There are risks in there, but the risks of inaction loom large, and many of those actions that need to take place are to those that promote inclusive growth. What should the priorities be? is the pursuit of the vision of integration. It's important for driving growth, I think, as I've argued. You need to focus on broadening participation, removing barriers to participation as well, and then empowering participation in the economy. And then lastly, it's promoting resilience, resilience to climate change that we all suffer from, and as well as the disaster risk reduction. So I'll end my presentation now, and I'm happy to take any questions that are germane to the work that we do and the presentation that I've just made. Thank you very much. So, any questions? So have I bamboozled you with far too much data and numbers to effectively engage your interest in this set of issues? Sorry, sir. Yes, sir. Could you identify yourself and your media agency, please?
Li Bolio, Voice of America. I have a question about TPP. As you know, that United States is pushing for more countries to join. But yesterday we heard from the Philippines trade officials that the country of the Philippines already enjoy free tariff, no tariff for 70% of the export to the United States. I'm wondering if TPP is really useful, or any other kind of trade, free trade agreement, is that useful to address what you just said about the slowdown in the economy here? If it's not free trade, what is it, or what are they that you think can really upgrade or enhance the economic growth in this region? Thanks.
Well, I'll begin. I don't know if Don or Ambassador Tang, if you would like to chime in on this. I mean, you mentioned that about 70% of exports from the Philippines enter into the U.S. market tariff-free. But of course, there's another 30% of goods, and I think you'd have to probably look at the trade-weighted average to get a real sense of the barriers to Philippine products that enter into the U.S. market. The other point I think that's changed in the way trade operates is that much of global trade now takes place through global value chains. Nothing is really produced in any one single economy today. They go through various stages of production in different locations around the world. Any country's or economy's ability to capture tasks or be part of those chains very much depends on sort of the general business environment as well as the sort of final barrier to entry, the tariff rate, if you like. Because of the proliferation of FTAs in the region, those that have preferential access to the market really benefit very much from being part of that FTA because of I don't want to get too technical, but because of the accumulation within the FTA. And so it's not, you can't just look at the tariff within the bilateral relationship, but you have to look at this whole series of tariffs in the whole supply chain. And that's something that we look at quite a lot. I'd emphasize the importance of investment and services in trade today. The Philippines, of course, is known for being preponderantly a services-driven economy. Services are a growing part of the Philippine export repertoire, if you like, but there's much more that can be done to promote the export of services. So the entry of the Philippines into the TPP and indeed other trade agreements would greatly help, I think, services exports from the Philippines and other Asia-Pacific economies. So is it beneficial? I'd argue yes. A lot of the benefits that we model actually come from domestic reforms that need to take place within, say, customs and other things. It's a very complicated set of numbers. Happy to engage you one-on-one if you like. Don, you've been with us.
I guess I would just add that we tend to traditionally look at free trade agreements in terms of barrier reduction, but that is becoming a significantly less important issue in trading relationships as barriers have progressively come down in the WTO system and in the various trade agreements. And what is really important, and this feeds into the whole issue of structural reform, are what we call behind the borders sets of issues. And increasingly trade agreements, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, are addressing these issues, and these are the ones that are going to, with the increase in efficiency, with the appropriate level of regulation, with the streamlining of the bureaucratic processes, those are the things that are really going to affect growth and trade. And as Eduardo has said, it is trade and services, it is global value chains, it is the ease of doing trade and investment that are going to be important and bring prosperity to the economies who are members of these. So I think those are the real benefits of an agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Please, sir.
Good morning. My name is Aaron. I'm from the Brunei Times. I would like to ask a question regarding the surveys, the respondents on the most important factor promoting inclusive growth. And I would like to get the panel's opinion on the survey's respondents saying that public education is the most important factor. Generally, from real-life examples, I'm starting to notice that, for example, there's more and more people attending higher education, for example. But actually,
could you speak closer to your mic? It's very hard to hear you.
Hello?
Yep, that's
okay,
better.
Sorry. So I was asking about the most important factor with regards to inclusive growth. And most of the survey respondents indicated that it was education. Now, judging more and more people are actually attending higher education, for example. But actually, this is corresponding to a real-life scenario where there are more and more unemployed graduates. So I would like to get the panel's opinion if more education actually guarantees inclusive growth, and if it guarantees, what is the actual mechanism that it guarantees inclusive growth?
I mean, the economic analysis does show the need for higher education, especially as economic production and economic activities become more and more sophisticated. There are high levels of automation coming into the production process. It really does actually highlight the need for more vocational education. It's a very, very complex set of questions. So many of the jobs that we have today did not exist, say, 10 to 15 years ago. I mean, the classic example, of course, is right here in the Philippines with the BPO sector. It didn't exist 20 years ago. Is the education system coming out with the necessary skills for people to effectively engage in that? As the Philippines seeks to move up the value chain. You're moving from call centers to more sophisticated technical assistance things. Is the education system providing the skills for those people? And the other problem that you have is technology is moving so quickly. The classic examples we see is, say, the rate of adoption of technologies. A television took so many years to reach an audience of 50 million. I think Facebook did it in 2 years. Everything moves very, very quickly. It's not necessarily providing specific sets of skills, but the ability to continue to learn and adapt in this extremely fast-paced environment. Don, do you want to speak? Any others?
Excuse me, sir. I'm Sophie from Must TV, and I have 2 questions. So the first one is, how do you think of the prospect of Chinese economy in the upcoming years, and how will it influence the regional growth in Asia-Pacific region? Do you think the GDP growth will continue to fall in the few years? Thank you.
There was a huge amount of interest in China's economy in our survey. China is a very important trading partner for most Asia-Pacific economies. I have an expert sitting next to me, so I won't impinge on his views here.
Okay. Thank you for your question. And I just want to make a few points about China's economic situation. First, I should say that China's economy and its slowdown was caused by the global financial crisis. 7 years ago. And I still remember that a few weeks after the financial crisis, the mayor of Shanghai told me that hundreds of ships, ocean-going ships, had to stop in the harbor because many foreign orders for Chinese commodity goods were either canceled or drastically cut. Then, a few months after the financial crisis, the officials in Guangdong province told a group of diplomats that tens of hundreds of workers lost their job because of the closure of the factories which produces goods for export. So you can see the impact of the global financial crisis. And now the world is still in the weak recovery of the world economy. And China's economy is deeply integrated with the world. So China could not stand unaffected in the world today. We are still affected by the world financial crisis. So this is the first point. Second point, I should say that the financial crisis is a bad thing, but it's also a good thing because it taught China a lesson that for a country like China, which has more than 1.3 billion people, the export-driven economy was not sustainable for China. So from that time, we were determined to change the mode of development, to change the economic structure, to reform our economy, and to improve the industry. And we want to shift the export-oriented economy into the export and consumption-oriented economy in the country. And we also shift extensive model of growth to the intensive growth. And we also want to shift over-reliance on investment to the greater balance between investment and consumption. I should say that we are now still in the process. But just now you mentioned the GDP growth. For the first half of this year, it's 7%. I should say it's not easy for China to achieve this target. And we should also look at this 7% in this way, that the 7% growth actually generates more increase in volume than the double-digit growth in the past. It's very simple. If we say 10% of 100, that's 10. If we say 7% of 200, it's 14. So definitely 14 is bigger than 10. And of course, I should say that the fundamentals of China's economy are basically good. And the economy is still within a reasonable range. So that's why I should say that we are very optimistic about China's future. There are many reasons. I just want to mention two. First, the China's economy is resilient and full of potential. And now we're going through a process of industrialization, urbanization, agricultural modernization, and also the IT application. It will provide great potential for China's future growth. And it's estimated that by 2025, China's domestic consumption expenditure will reach 10 trillion US dollars. Secondly, I want to say that the ongoing structural reform is constantly delivering benefits. So after China succeeds in its economic transformation and industrial upgrading, it will enter into a steadier, more quality-driven, and a more sustainable development stage. And by that time, I think China will play a better role as the engine of the regional as well as world economic development. Thank you.
Good. Are there any more questions? Yep, please.
I'm Victor Saulon from Business World, the Philippines.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. You mentioned in your summary that one of the priorities is resiliency on climate change and energy. Mm-hmm. What are your views with the fact that the region doesn't have different levels of growth, different levels of energy needs?
I'm sorry, I'm very happy.
Yeah.
It's very
What are your views on the fact that the region have different levels of energy needs? Countries in the region have different levels of energy needs, and they have different pledges on how they plan to cut gas emissions. So what are your views on this?
Yeah. Do you want to? I mean, the Asia-Pacific region is an extremely sort of diverse set of economies, very, very different levels of development. Some very advanced economies, some still emerging, some with some natural endowments in, say, energy sources. Canada, of course, has a lot of energy resources. Indonesia has endowments in, say, coal and other things. Canada, natural gas. Australia, natural gas. It's very hard to come up with a sort of generic or a single set of things that this region should do in terms of energy needs. What they have done is to set some specific goals on the reduction of energy intensity in terms of GDP production. So this leaves each economy at its own to decide how they're going to go about doing that. As far as I think I think you're really interested in the emission story. It's a very difficult issue to grapple with. We did some very similar survey work to this in 2011. The single priority that the policy community thought that policymakers could do was the promotion of energy efficiency to start off with. There are lots and lots of other things that people look at, increased use of solar, increased use of marine energy. There are questions about the future of nuclear technology and so on. It's a very complicated question, and I can't do a simple one. It probably deserves a very thick book, but thank you for the question.
We will have to take only one question now, as I think you have some other schedules coming up. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact us, and the report will be available online at www.pecc.org. One last question, please. Thank you.
Good. Well, I think we got off easy this morning. Thank you very much for your time. You can contact Jessica or any of us directly if you have specific questions on the report. Thank you very much.